Hey guys, what's up? It's River, and today we're doing an in-depth review of the Sony a6500 for 2019. Does it make sense to buy this camera in 2019? Does it hold up? Does it have the right features? How does it compare to everything else that's on the market right now? And is it still worth it? Let's do an in-depth review, take a look at exactly what this camera does and if it's right for you. Let's get into it. So let's talk about specs. This tiny little munchkin right here, known as the a6500, does 11 frames per second in terms of photo speed, has a 24.2 megapixel APS-C sensor, and has an ISO range from 100 to 21,000, which is amazing for a tiny little camera, which is just over $1,000. As for video, it does 23, 30, and 60 at 1080, and I still can't believe it. For a 2-year-old camera, it does 1080 at 120 frames per second. And on top of that, it does 4K at 23 and 30, which is amazing for 2017. Like this camera was a beast in 2017. And in 2019, all of those features hold up. Like Sony hasn't really made an APS-C camera that outperforms the a6500 even in 2019. I'm still very impressed with the specs on this thing. One of the things that I really appreciated that Sony did for this camera is that in 2017, they added S-Log2, they added cinema profiles to this camera, and they still hold up. A lot of times when you look at older cameras like the Canon 5D Mark III or the Canon 5D Mark II, you look at that image and you're like, I can tell this is an older camera. They don't really grade very well, the color science isn't quite right, but for 2019, this camera still holds up, it still competes with the modern cameras that are coming out. And I actually really believe that if you shot something on this camera, graded it, put it next to a 2019 camera, this thing holds up and you actually cannot tell that it's an older camera. The 4K in this baby really holds up. It's actually a 6K image that is downsampled to 1080 or 4K. So this camera ends up being extra sharp. And if you don't really know what that means, if you're like not a techie, it just means this camera looks beautiful. One of my favorite features about this camera is the built-in stabilization. Basically what that means is that it makes your footage extra smooth, whether you're shooting on a Sony lens or not. Sony, I personally believe, has the best in-body stabilization when it comes to DSLRs. And what I love about Sony is that they stabilize their lenses and their body. So if you have both, if you have a Sony lens and a Sony body, you get buttery smooth footage. And if you're using off-brand lenses like a Sigma or a Canon on your Sony, you still get benefits from your camera. It still looks smooth, which is something that most companies can't say because they generally tend to stabilize their lenses instead of their bodies. So even in 2019, this camera has great built-in stabilization. Gimbals are great, but if you want to do a lot of handheld work and you want to keep your stuff smooth, this camera is fantastic. Let's talk about focus. Sony is known for having amazing autofocus in this camera. I personally believe that Canon's dual pixel autofocus and Sony's autofocus is just about neck and neck. It really kind of depends on the situation, but this camera has fabulous autofocus. However, for 2017, the autofocus was phenomenal. It's still really good autofocus, but if you're somebody that wants a super duper advanced version of autofocus, Sony has recently been putting out their newest version of autofocus in the Sony a6400 and the Sony a9, and that autofocus is like otherworldly. Feel free to check out the a64 review on that autofocus. It's genuinely just otherworldly. So if you're looking for a camera that's purely just on the base of autofocus, I would actually say go for the Sony a6400 or the Sony a9, but the Sony a9 is in the thousands and thousands. The Sony a6400 is a little bit cheaper, but it's missing a few features. There is a video, shameless plug, a6400 versus a6500. The a6400 is a very good gimbal camera, but if you're looking for something that's handheld, if you're looking to do a lot of run and gun shooting, this autofocus is still gonna hold up. This camera is still fabulous in 2019. I would recommend this camera if you want built-in stabilization with the autofocus, but if you don't care about the built-in stabilization, I look into the Sony a6400 or the Sony a9. This camera, just overall, it's a tiny little package. It's very small. It's only about 450 grams. Has so much performance. It has so much built in and such a robust design. Me and my friend Thomas both got one in 2017 and it's still holding up. Camera has a few scuffs and scratches, but it doesn't feel like it's falling apart. It feels like it's gonna last me for like another 5-6 years. I genuinely don't think I'm ever gonna get rid of it. It's one of my favorite cameras that I own. And now speaking of size, this camera is super tiny. And one of the first things that I thought was, I could vlog with it. Sadly, you can't really see yourself, but if you're someone that can get past the screen issue on this camera is really light. It would actually be a really good vlogging camera. It's got a nice microphone thing up top. You can't monitor your audio because it doesn't have a headphone jack, but it's light enough that you could potentially use this as a vlogging camera. Personally, I think this makes a great travel camera. If you're someone that makes travel documentaries, personal travel work, or travel cinematic work, this camera would be fantastic because, like, look how tiny it is. And now, if you didn't know this about Sony cameras already, I hate to be the one to tell you, the batteries in these cameras is terrible. Like, terrible, terrible, terrible. They're not like abysmal, like they still last about an hour, but compared to like Canon batteries that will last you all day, and if you're like smart about it and you turn your camera off between shots, it will last you like a couple of days. These batteries leave a lot to be desired. However, they're really cheap. You can pick them up for about $14 to $20 on Amazon. Usually like a 2-pack comes for about like $25 or $30. They're really cheap, really affordable. When I bought my first Sony camera, I bought like 9, so I pretty much never ran out of batteries. If this camera came out today, I would be super upset with the battery, but this is a 2-year-old camera. Sony's been figuring out their thermals and battery issues for the last 2 years. So it's not great battery, but considering the fact that it's a 2-year-old camera and you can buy these batteries super cheap, you know, kind of balances out. Something I do want to address with these cameras, it's not directly affecting these cameras, but the lenses that Sony makes. Sony makes really, really top-notch lenses, and even in 2019, a 2017 kit lens holds up. So if you do decide to invest in one of these cameras, also make sure to invest in some of the glass, because that glass really holds up. If you buy like a G Master lens, it's about $2,500, but that's the last lens you'll ever need. I highly recommend it. I personally like the Sony lenses over the Canon lenses. And this camera has great low light. I'm genuinely blown away by it. It does 20,000 relatively clean. At about 16,000 and 10,000, it's really, really, really usable. For a camera that's just over $1,000 and came out in 2017, this is kind of a low light monster too. Sony generally makes very good low light cameras, and this camera is not an exception to that. Compared to the other Sony cameras that are on the market, it's not quite as good as the a7 III, but considering that this is half the price, I'm really impressed with the low light in this camera. And in 2019, the closest competitor for the a6500, I would say, is the Canon 80D. And personally, the Canon 80D is nice and robust. It has a really good body. It has a flip-up screen for vlogging, and it has a way better battery life, but it does not have the same great slow-mo option, it does not have 4K, and it does not have the built-in color science. If you were using it for vlogging, I would definitely recommend the Canon 80D. If you're looking to do cinematic work, travel work, and just work that needs really heavy color grading and a very cinematic look, I would definitely recommend the a6500 over pretty much almost any of the Canon DSLRs. Canon makes great cameras, but they just leave a lot to be desired when it comes to color science. Looking at this camera in 2019, it's still really, really good. It has built-in stabilization, tons of slow-mo option, great color science, it's nice and compact, and the internal 4K is super sharp. And did I mention the low light in this camera? This camera is still super worth buying in 2019. Hey guys, thanks again for checking out the video. There's a link in the description below for the best pricing on this camera, and be sure to like and subscribe for future content. If you have any questions whatsoever about this camera, other cameras, if you just want to chat about filmmaking, leave me a comment down below, and I'll be sure to get back to every single one of you. Until next time, guys.